And welcome to your Scottish Parliament. I'm very pleased to be able to chair this evening's session. My name is Maggie Chapman, MSP, and I am one of the directors of the Scotland's Futures Forum. And this evening's event is in conjunction, it's hosted by the Scottish Futures Forum. Today we're exploring a question that sits at the heart of democracy, at the heart of democratic innovation, and also at the heart of our concerns around the robustness and rigour of our democracy. Will AI support or supplant human participation in politics? As AI tools become embedded in political life, from campaign chatbots and synthetic avatars to deepfakes and automated decision-making, we are at a critical juncture. How do we ensure these technologies enhance rather than erode our democracy and our democratic engagement? The panel we have this evening brings together experts in political communication, ethics, futurism, and digital power structures to help us unpack the opportunities and risks. So I'm very pleased to be joined this evening by Bob Moran, who is a partner at Brunswick Group in Washington, DC, a seasoned strategist, futurist, and author of Lincoln 2.0, with a career spanning political consulting, global communications, and thought leadership on the future of AI. And yes, he's brought his book with him. Christian Vakari, who is chair in future governance at the University of Edinburgh, and whose research explores how digital media shapes political communication, engagement, and power. And Professor Eva Luger, who's chair of Human Data Interaction at the University of Edinburgh. She is co-program director of BRAID, which is the Bridging Responsible AI Divides, and the Responsible NLP Centre for Doctoral Training. Her research explores the social, ethical, and interactional implications of AI and other data-driven technologies. So please join me in welcoming our panel this evening. As ever with a Festival of Politics, please do engage with our online presence as well. You can do so using the handle @VisitScottParl on X, or on Twitter, as I called it earlier, or the handle @ScottParl on Instagram. And you will know that these events will be recorded and available for viewing on the Scottish Parliament's YouTube channel at a later date. So again, thank you very much for being here this evening. We'll kick off then, and I'll begin with an opener. Please do share your thoughts on how artificial intelligence might influence democratic processes, our democracies as a whole, not only thinking about elections, but also broader political decision-making and local governance. Bob, I'll come to you first.
Sure. So I think that at the beginning, we're going to see AI used as a tool by political campaigners to probably write better speeches and things like that. You're also going to start to see it as a decision support tool among decision makers, asking their own sort of AIs, for advice. Over time, though, you're going to see in the campaign world, and we're already seeing it in South Korea, in India, the United States, and in Great Britain, avatars that will be supporting campaign avatars that look like a political candidate, supporting that campaign and answering questions 24/7. And then over time, I think you're going to see an actual AI run for office.
So some people might be quite excited by some of those things. Some of that might look quite dystopian to other people, and we'll unpick some of those areas as we progress through our discussion this evening. But Eva, what are your views on where AI can and will be used in democracy?
Well, I think I'm going to maybe focus a little bit on what I think is like some of the underpinning issues. So I think AI is starting to, degrade our information climate, and I think it's doing that in three ways. So one, this idea of disintermediation, and that really means that now things like chat are going to disrupt the kind of the traditional top-down information flow that we see on the internet. So whereas previously we would have gone to a source like the BBC to try and find out a fact, now there are chatbots that sit between sources and us. So this kind of, the mediation that we've seen before is being fractured and fragmented. And so therefore, sort of our trust and it is being called into question because of that. The second kind of characteristic is user behavior. So this is how, I suppose, we are being influenced by systems design. So we're increasingly expecting news to be personalised to us. There's lots of research that shows this. We no longer expect to be able to pick a newspaper and just sort of, even then, arguably, it was personalised, right? If you like The Guardian, you pick up The Guardian. But now it's being much more personalised to us in a much more fragmented way. We're online and we see little bits of news depending on which platform we're on. And younger generations are now expecting this to happen. So there's this phenomenon called the news find me phenomenon, which is basically the idea that a certain generation will not look for source. They will expect news to find them. And if it doesn't find them, it's just not important enough. It's a genuine phenomenon. And actually you're seeing older generations accepting this as a kind of a behavioural norm as well. And then, so there's two things. Then finally, the rise of epistemic harms. So these are harms related to knowledge, essentially. So the harms that happen when this kind of knowledge environment is being eroded. So one of the things is that the number of central gatekeepers has decreased. So the people that gatekeep knowledge and make sure that it's truthful, they're sort of being eroded, and we're having different players coming into the field for whom truth is something that we question. That maybe there's an alternative truth. There's been an abandonment of fact-checking by organisations like Twitter. Sorry, I was going to say Twitter is X, isn't it? And Meta, where they've just openly said the facts don't matter. Citizens must have access to epistemic rights to be able to function within a democracy. So that's what I'd say. Those three things are AI-mediated issues that are affecting our ability to engage in democratic processes globally.
And all of those are potentially negative in their consequence. I wonder. I'm sure. Well, we will come out to tease some of those out a little bit more. Christian, that initial opener to you then.
Thank you. I mean, my colleagues have said a lot of things I agree with, so I'll focus on something slightly different. We think about democracy as, the worst political system apart from all the other systems we know, to quote Churchill, and a system that manages to deal with trade-offs between liberty and equality in a way that, in Western societies at least, we find to be acceptable. We have enough freedom, partly because we have enough equality. And once you dial these up or down in other systems, you have arrangements that are less desirable, that are too authoritarian or too unequal. We're obviously witnessing an explosion in inequality even in democratic societies. How can, a lot of the debate on artificial intelligence has been focusing on the liberties that it might give us or that it might reduce for us, censorship, but also the ability to, do things more quickly, reach people more effectively, and so forth. But there's also a big equality and actually inequality component to the landscape of artificial intelligence, partly because the keys to the biggest models, to the biggest tools are owned by very few people, gigantic, hugely funded corporations, or in the case of China, state-backed corporations. And partly because the content through which artificial intelligence or large language models are trained is not necessarily a cross-section of the population or what people think or what people write online, but it actually reflects a lot of biases. It doesn't represent minorities very accurately. It tends to be biased against women, surprise, surprise. So it reflects and potentially amplifies, especially if used for decision-making, especially if used, for example, by local governments deciding how to prioritize resources. It could amplify those inequalities that already exist and that are widening because of other factors that have, to do with other structural changes in society.
Thank you all. So, I'm interested there, Christian, you're talking about the amplification of inequalities, and Bob, you talked about AI being useful to, to help and advise decision-making process. What are the democratic risks of using a biased system, or at the very best, a system that is using partial information for that decision-making process? What does that do, not only for the decisions themselves, but actually for the consequences of those decisions?
So I think this is a this is a great question. So what's interesting is over the last few months in my world, we've been having a lot of discussions about this question and a related question, which is what are the limits of AI that we have right now? And one of the limits is it's garbage in, garbage out, right? It's based on the things that are used to train. We're talking about large language models basically right now. So it's used on all of the things that are used to train that AI model are that's all it knows. So what's fun is in a commercial sense, we've had this big question of, can these things generate anything novel? If they're all based on past data, can they generate something that's truly novel or not? It might be a mashup of old things, and so I think that's one question. The other question is, and is related to what you're talking about, is, okay, if this thing I'm interacting with can only give me answers based on things that we fed it, but there are other ways of understanding reality, and we did not feed this model those other data points, then what it's telling me is it's giving me a narrowed range of options. And so from a strategy standpoint, it's not giving me all the potential information, right? It's like an analyst that is only looking at one data set. And so there you go.
And the restrictions that will then lead to in terms of the creative potential of decision makers is plain and potentially quite damaging. Eva, what are the in that sense of, and you talked about the sort of limiting of rights in many ways. How do you see the connections between the phenomenal power that AI might have, to free up people's time to do some of the grunt work of analysis, for instance? How do you see that challenge given the increasing pressure on decision makers' time? How do we protect against that retreat to using this partial and skewed support?
I think there are ways of using different. It depends. Like AI, it covers a whole set of tools, models, and approaches. Right? It's not one thing. It's often anthropomorphized, and it shouldn't be. There are some very fundamental and basic tools that you can use that are AI-driven that allow you to, reach decisions or support decision making. It doesn't have to make the decision for you. And I think that's when we think about AI, we often think about ChatGPT, which seems to provide an entire solution. Essentially, you ask it a question, it responds as though it's human. It gives you all of this information, but. So, for example, people who work with, large databases or large data sets, like I'm thinking about Hansard, for example, it's incredibly difficult to parse. It's really hard to understand, put together a summary of it. It will take you hours and hours and hours to run that through a language model, and you get a summary really quickly. And you can, purchase the use of language models that are designed specifically on a smaller data set to do smaller level tasks. So that's one way that you can do it. You can use different types of AI models. I think the danger with using larger scale models that have been trained on a data set that because we have no sense of what ChatGPT is trained on. We can guess it is all of the internet, but there's probably other data sets as well. And we can't conceivably imagine what biases might emerge. Maybe we can, because we know how awful we were historically, and it's essentially historical data and pulling our bad behavior forward into the future as well with us, isn't it? But so I think you just avoid using the large proprietary models and use specifically small ones that are designed for a particular task, which is not a sexy answer, really, but I think that's really the only way to ensure that you're not having biased or erroneous answers. And the other thing to note is that these things are not 100% accurate. In fact, we're looking at 95% accuracy at best, and that's accuracy on the basis of what it perceives to be accurate as well. So there's another interpretive level there. So the models actually are incredibly complex, have loads of complex parameters, and I wouldn't trust them to make difficult decisions or in sensitive contexts. And the EU AI Act, I think, has it right. There are some areas within which we shouldn't be using generative models at all.
So just to add, because we're in this absolutely stunningly beautiful Parliament building, I was chatting with this fellow who he runs the Mensa Foundation and the Mensa Foundation magazine, so they're focused on intelligence. He has a theory that basically the more we use AI, artificial intelligence, the more we have to use collective intelligence. Now, I think everyone in this room believes in democracy, and we're sitting in a temple of democracy, right? But what's interesting is, I think like most of us, I believe in democracy because I believe people are equal. But I also believe in democracy because I believe in collective intelligence, that all of us together can actually come up with better solutions than any one of us individually. That's my theory. And so I do think that there is this interesting pairing of artificial intelligence and collective intelligence, and I think they work together. So I think artificial intelligence can help us, but I also think we need to use other tools, right? I mean, and there are a lot of other collective intelligence tools that we could use, including tools where you would have people place different bets or things on outcomes, for example. I mean, all these things are available now. So I do think there's a combination of using AI and collective intelligence as well.
And is there an absolutely necessary role for that collective intelligence to maintain any kind of trust in the process? Because I think the potential for AI to undermine trust in politicians, in political decision making, is quite high if we don't have yes, there is a human in there somewhere. And I'm interested in how you see the relationship between, maybe people don't trust politics anyway, so, are we losing anything? Some might ask, but how do we maintain, or can we use technology to help us regain trust in some of the political processes? Christian.
You're absolutely right that we're in a pandemic of low trust in Western democracies. Interestingly, in authoritarian regimes, trust is very high. In government, in institutions, reported trust, yes. In democracies where we can say what we want to surveys, to pollsters, these levels of trust are incredibly low by historical standards. Their trust in media is low, although trust in media people use is higher than trust in media in general. Technology can help or hinder trust. It can help increase trust if it is used to make reality more intelligible, if it's used to make the functioning of institutions more transparent. But it can also hinder trust to the extent that, for example, the proliferation of misinformation, or the proliferation of the idea that there is a lot of misinformation and nothing can be trusted in the first place, creates a culture where nothing can be trusted, where the default position is I shouldn't trust anything. And also the default position for politicians then becomes, or any elites, becomes that they can sidestep responsibility by saying, oh no, that isn't true. That news report is fake news. That I didn't say that. And if a lot of people believe that everything can be true, then nothing can be true, which is the Russian approach to disinformation. It's no longer to convince people that what the state says is true, is to convince people that everything can be true, nothing can be true, and everything is possible.
Eva, do you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a step before that, which is ensuring that we have good AI literacy programs, because AI, like any technology, is a tool, and if you don't know how to use it, how can you conceivably trust it? It's not like a brand, some obviously function as a brand, or some models sit under a brand, but actually at the moment we don't have robust or good or easily accessible AI literacy programs, certainly not in the UK, and so trust is a bit of an abstract idea. What do you base that on? You need to understand broadly how a model operates, so you need to understand where you might be able to trust them and where not. You need the tools to be able to make decisions about information veracity, about whether this is an instrument that you want to adopt in a particular context. And I think we're just not, we haven't got that kind of robust framework just now. There are people working towards it. But then we have the issue of those people who are most marginalised within society are the ones who don't have access to any of this, all these conversations. And so how do we ensure that AI literacy is embedded into, for example, essential skills programming, so that we know it's where essential skills being literacy, numeracy and digital skills, where you embed AI literacy within that as well, so that people get a robust kind of training into the kind of the rights that they have as well under this, because that's the other thing I think that undermines trust is that we keep talking about, people having rights and, the right to be forgotten. And everybody talks about these kinds of rights as though we all know what they are, but we don't. Who knows how to articulate those rights in practice? We don't have any mechanisms for recourse. They are not accessible. They're expensive at best. And they're not available to most people. If you felt that an algorithmic decision had gone against you and you could prove it was an algorithmic decision, what would you do about it? Does anybody have an idea? I don't. I have absolutely no idea, and I study this. So, but we have those instruments that should allow you to push against it. How do we do that? We're not equipped.
So there's something about the governance of all of this. Education, yes, but also governance, because if the technologies are leaping ahead in a way that we aren't keeping up, or the vast majority of us are not keeping up, how do we ensure governance? And Christian, within your role of future governance, how do you even begin to think about that thing in the future that's now, that none of our systems, our legal systems, our education systems, nothing has kept up with? How do we even begin to not rein these things in, but to curate them in a way that doesn't lead to, either very, very poor decision making or poor decision making at best, and real damage to communities, to individuals, to our environments at worst?
It's a really important and challenging problem. We are at a time with a permanent fiscal crisis in most democracies, where there's never enough money, where the state is, public institutions are required to either do more or, deal with the same problems, but the problems are becoming more serious, or the opportunities are bigger. Thinking about health, it's wonderful that we have access to all these cures or to, forms of personalized medicine, but they're very expensive. And where is the money for that? Where are the infrastructures to guarantee effective governance in the 21st century, where people legitimately expect efficient and effective services? So there is no question that these technologies can be helpful. They can, institutions are overwhelmed with information. They're overwhelmed with things they need to do, and they don't have sufficient resources to do that. So these tools can be helpful, and they are being used. The problem is there is not enough transparency on which tools are being used, how are they being audited, to what extent are they being tested against benchmarks, for example, for equality. Just very recently, there was research published by the London School of Economics, which shows that they fed 10 different large language models with field notes from social care workers looking at situations of people that needed help of different kind. And they asked the large language models to provide a summary and suggest some action points. So here are some notes about this person. What's the situation? What should we do? And the only thing that they changed is they randomized whether the person that was being talked about in these notes, which were real notes that they had obtained, was a man or a woman. So Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith. And guess what? Mr. Smith, according to most of the large language models, was faring more poorly and needed more help than Mrs. Smith. Now, nothing changed except for the fact that this was a man versus a woman. So that means that these large language models, if used without any further refinement and training, and it's very important what Eva was saying, we probably need much more localized tools for these functions. But if you use the large language models that are available to all of us, you get biased decisions that disadvantage women over men. So if public institutions, if local government are using these tools, and they probably have to if they're going to keep up with the demands, are they being transparent about the tools they're using? Are they auditing these tools for key outcomes such as not only efficiency but also quality and fairness? And are they telling us how they're auditing these tools? Are they showing us that they've taken care to make sure that these tools generate outcomes that are not only efficient, but also fair and egalitarian to the extent that it is possible?
Thanks. Bob, I saw you nodding there. What are how in democracies, how can we take back some of the control then? How can we bring democratic power to bear in some of these conversations?
Well, it's interesting. I think there are I have two thoughts. The first is, there was a time before we used the phrase personal computer. If you go back in time, computers were originally a building, and then they were in a part of a building, and they were owned only by very large institutions. And now everybody has multiple computers, in fact, many in your pockets and your phone and everything else. And so the question becomes, who owns this technology? And then at some point, will the people own the technology, or will the technology be fractured to such an extent that people can own it, like the personal computer, right? So I think that's one. I also think, because we're in the West and we've operated under common law, law takes time to catch up to economy. And so if you think about it, right, we had the industrial era, and then we had to figure out how to apply law to the industrial era. We had it for an agrarian era, harder to apply for the industrial, so we had to engineer new law. And I think we'll find ways, and that's what I'm saying, you referenced this, like what would your legal course of action be if you thought you were discriminated by an algorithm or something, right? So I think we will create legal precedent in this country, in my home country, and then also that our representative bodies will pass a body of law that will give people legal recourse and will put some boundaries on what is socially acceptable or not. Now, the challenge is going to be that basically nation states want to use the AI as a technology and quantum computing as a technology because they want to get a first mover advantage that's weaponized. And so you're going to have this interesting dance where on one hand, democracies want to work to find ways to, legal ways to ensure fairness among citizens of using this technology. On the other hand, nation states will want to develop it rapidly for other means, right? And so I think that's a challenge.
Just to add to these points, one of the challenges of regulation, and we've seen it with social media, is that we are essentially thinking about regulation in the dark, meaning that we don't really know the exact prevalence and impact of a lot of the harms that we talk about and that rightly public institutions might want to regulate. We spent 15 years more or less having some form of social media, and it has evolved a lot, but what hasn't changed is that our ability to really understand what's happening on social media is very limited. Most people doing my job, for 10 years we used tweets as a proxy to what happens on social media. Twitter is completely unrepresentative of what happens on other social media, and now we don't even have that data anymore because essentially the new management has shut down our access for data. So with artificial intelligence, yes, there are ways to audit it, indirectly by pinging it using methods where you ask a lot of questions and you collect the answers, but we don't really know how people are using it. We don't really know what's happening in people's everyday lives, and that data is impossible to access for researchers, apart from some very limited exceptions. Not to mention the fact that a lot of researchers that study complicated and important issues like misinformation are being harassed by politicians, and for political reasons in many countries, both in Europe and across the ocean. And so we have a problem of not only that regulation is usually looking behind, but regulation dealing with digital technologies impinges on potentially on freedom of expression and freedom of information, and therefore you need to be extremely careful before you limit people's freedom of expression. However, we cannot really quantify the extent of the problem and the effects of the problem because we don't have research that really tells us these things in a precise way.
Go ahead. Eva, and then Bob.
I'll quickly make the point as well that when regulations are being sort of discussed and decided upon, the large tech companies are in that room. So regulation is never made in isolation from, it's like having the fox in the hen house, isn't it? So, they're going to be, those tools are going to be useful for up to a point, but they're really not the protections that we need within a democratic society. Those will have to come from somewhere else.
And I suppose there's a link back to your question, if you're talking about education and AI literacy, there's a huge role for ensuring the AI literacy of politicians and of decision makers, and I can tell you we are not AI literate. I don't think I'm telling stories out of school there. Sorry, Bob, you wanted to say?
So we do know a little bit about how people behaviorally are using some of these things. So I'm going to give you a couple of fun ones. The first is, at least in the United States, the downloading and using of romantic partner AIs is taking off quite a bit. So if you don't know, you could go to Replica right now, and you could select your boyfriend or girlfriend and download it. And then that's what they're doing. They have a digital AI boyfriend or girlfriend based on Replica. So we do know that. We also know that search is being very quickly disrupted by the AI summary. And we had in the United States data from Pew Research Center, but even that's old. So I look at data all day long, and we run our own surveys, and the data that Pew had is already antiquated in terms of how quickly those AI summaries that you see when you search are disrupting. So when people, they're not going down and looking at the links where they might say, oh, I could read this article by the Library of Congress, which would theoretically be a better data source. They're just reading the summary, which may or may not be fully accurate. So that's the second little data point. The third data point is, just last week, I was at a business school, and I gave a big speech on thinking about AI in higher ed. And here are some fun data points about how business schools in America are now thinking about higher ed. Number one, the business school I was speaking at, they want to create AI tutors for all the main subjects in the business school so that students could use those 24/7. That's one. And that's going to happen this school year. That's the dean's goal, is to do that. The second thing is they want to create sort of AI versions of major business leaders through history and economics thinkers. So imagine Adam Smith with all the Adam Smith's writing, and you deal with the Adam Smith AI. And so the course would require you to talk to Adam Smith for an hour and learn about Wealth of Nations and how he thought about the end of mercantilism and the beginning of this new crazy thing called capitalism, right? And then the last thing they're thinking about is how you would create digital twins of professors. And so, a professor would teach an LLM or, to basically what it thinks and upload all of its material that it's ever lectured on. And this way, the students could essentially converse with the professor 24/7, 365, a twin of that professor, and then they could learn theoretically faster and then meet with the professors, with that professor in person. The theory is that this will change what business school looks like, that you'll do the case study work, that you'll do a lot of this other work using the technology, and then it elevates the human interactions, so that the theory is you're going to have a lot more, you will get rid of the busy work and have a lot more time where you just have the discussion with the professor, and it will be more like this and less lecture. So the theory is maybe the lecture goes away because AI is doing that, and then it's a lot of discussion about like business law or what have you, the classes. So this is a lot. I mean, I'm giving you, this is what a business school is thinking about right now.
Made me think of something,
Yeah.
which is, the idea that you can train an LLM on all of your lectures and things like that. Some of the things I'm really interested in, I read quite a lot about, I suppose, is the idea of this kind of like resistance or rebellion that occurs when people think, oh, I know how to make that data dirty, so that if an LLM, and if somebody tries to feed it into an LLM, it won't be able to get the data out of it needs. And there's lots of examples of this. And there's also examples of people hacking systems. So now there is, if you submit, and one of the conferences I submit to, computer science conferences, when I submit papers, they used to have to triage them, sort of work out which papers would be accepted and not. And now they do it automatically. But you can you can include little bits of text in there that will mean that you game that system so your paper gets automatically to the next level. And so people also, I think, and maybe this is like a little hope on the horizon, that people learn how to game, not just technical people, but if you understand enough about the parameters of a system, you know how to break it. We've all done it. We've all put like the little camera on your laptop, put a sticky on it just in case somebody hacks it. You know, people do these kind of social hacks all the time, and I'm really interested to see where that goes, because I mean, I'm not anti-AI. I'm absolutely not. I think I'm just immersed in it, so I tend to sort of edge onto the critical side. But I do like the idea that we're able to reclaim some of the things that would otherwise, that this like technological determinism, where we end up in a world where there are, you know, AIs running for office and what have you. Like, surely we can push back against this. I mean, don't we want to keep some of our humanity in this context, I wonder?
So what's fun about this is, just at the business school, we're talking about what in the future, what becomes scarce and what becomes abundant. And so the things that become scarce become really valuable. And this gets to the human. So there's a wonderful book I strongly recommend. It's called The Most Human Human. It's written by a humanities professor who was asked to play the role of the human in a Turing test. You know, you guys know how a Turing test works. And so then he started having all these meditations on what does it mean to be human. And then that's the book. It's called The Most Human Human. And so at the business school, we were like, well, what does it mean then? What's the scarce thing? Handwritten notes, time with the professor. You know, it's so in a way, it could turn out that this gives us more time to be the most human human. And so we start to emphasize the things that are human, like a handwritten note, or spending time with a student having tea and just talking about what the book they read or whatever. So there could be, you're right, there could be a pushback, but it could be great too.
But like those things come at a premium. Like that, they'll be accessible to people that have decent salaries. But if suddenly something, it's a bit like, so what's it called, sourdough bread. Right, how expensive is like sourdough bread was the thing my grandmother used to make. You know, it was cheap as chips, and then you could buy like ready packaged bread. And we were all very excited about this when I was a child. It was like, oh, that's posh bread. You have to pay good money for it. Now sourdough bread's like £7 or £8 for a loaf, and you can get the packaged bread for sort of, you know, much less money. So if we then extend that kind of idea to, you know, time and professors' time, what if professors' time is just too expensive for most people to be able to afford? Because there has been a little uptick in things like live music. People are now enjoying live music more because they're sort of tired of the kind of the digitized content that's constantly being pushed at them. And there's lots of data points showing now that within particular types of craft and live experiences, there's an uptick in people's interest. But that comes with expense. You know, I mean, how do you make this in a sort of an egalitarian way? I think that's the question that I don't understand. In our current economic model, can you even? Are we always going to be shafting the poor person?
And does it give us an opportunity to value media that clearly cannot be corrupted by AI? But I suppose that question of inequality is interesting, because I think even if we're talking about regulation and we think, oh, you know, regulation or this thing that could be dangerous, could be manipulative, could be all of those things. Regulation's obviously a good thing, but if you are regulating it from a particular power structure or a particular position, what are you regulating out? And who's being excluded in that? And there are levels of exclusion everywhere you look, if you care to look for them. And I suppose one of the questions is, are we looking?
So, you know, it's interesting. One theory is authenticity. So the things that are the most authentic, like getting a handwritten letter from someone, could be the most valuable. But then, you know, in the book, I explored sort of what is authentic and what isn't. And so in the book, the main character, they build an AI based on Abraham Lincoln, and they run it for president. And the main character is a political consultant who is not a good person, but with obvious flaws. But he starts to talk to the candidate, the AI candidate. And what happens over time is the people on the campaign team begin interacting with this AI candidate just like they would interact with any other candidate. They call him 2.0. And he starts to interact with this Abraham Lincoln candidate in an authentic way, so much so that Abraham Lincoln, the AI candidate, starts to talk to Russ, the character in the book, about having melancholia, which was the term we used in the 19th century America for depression, which Abraham Lincoln famously suffered from. And so, you know, basically the main character of the book is talking about having depression with with a revivified Abraham Lincoln, and it is an authentic discussion, or is it? And that's an interesting question in the world of AI. But it felt authentic to him, so.
I suppose, is there a way in which, taking that point about authenticity, is there a way in which that can actually be emancipatory for people in their engagement with AI, whether it's in education or politics, democracy? Is there a way in which that the very act of interacting might actually in itself be freeing for people? Christian, you talked about the sort of tension between liberty or freedom and censorship and liberty and constraint. Interested in how you see the positives, I suppose, in that.
Well, we live at a time where people are overwhelmed with information. In all surveys, they tell us, a lot of people tell us there is too much news, too much information, things are too complicated. That's one key reason why people say they avoid the news. Procedures to obtain, basic public services have become quite complex, especially for people from lower socioeconomic status, to the point that they need help from charities to apply for things like benefits. So if we think about artificial intelligence as what people call, what scholars call a cultural technology, so a technology that makes information accessible and makes it possible to translate information from one domain to others. Think like the printing press, which made some information accessible to people that previously didn't have the possibility to access it, and allowed people producing information to distribute, to put that information out there. So if we think about artificial intelligence as that kind of technology, then surely a lot of people will be empowered by some of its uses. They will be able to, provided that they get more broadly accurate responses, they will be able to cut through complex regulations and complex bureaucracies and understand what they're supposed to do. They'll be able to more quickly write a letter to their counselor complaining that there is a broken pothole on the street. Mm-hmm. They will be able to get, a decent summary of the news that is out there that is relevant to them. We're talking earlier about personalized news. So these are all, potentially uses of the technology that can empower people, that can, particularly for those who don't have the resources to get more privileged access, it improves their position vis-a-vis the information deluge that we're all facing. Going back to what we were saying earlier, though, about the economics and the inequalities in contemporary economic systems in capitalist societies, it seems to me quite likely that we will go to tiered systems where most people, the vast majority, will get something relatively basic that will be more or less free. And as they say, when it's free, you are the product, right? So people getting free access to these tools, just like us getting free access to most social media, our engagement will be monetized in some way, and there will be this digital labor economy whereby what we do, we get something out of the tools, but we also put something in, and the level of service we get is, low to medium. And then there will be, more premium levels. I mean, you can already see that with LLMs, and we'll see that with a lot more applications in the future, which will be increasingly less accessible and increasingly reserved to people who are more privileged.
There's lots more that we could go on, and I am keen to bring the audience into questions, but get thinking for your question. The last question I'm going to pose just now is, what are the roles, or could AI candidates even, Bob, you talked about avatars maybe becoming fully fledged candidates, what would they mean for civic participation in democratic structures?
So I'm going to give you a couple data points on things that have already happened. And one of the problems I had when I was writing the novel is that fact was catching up with my fiction very quickly. So I'm going to share this with you. In 2015, I wrote an article called Lincoln 2.0, and I wrote it just after being here at the Festival of Politics in Edinburgh. And I was exploring what would happen if you could you run an AI for president, right? That's the genesis of the novel. So it's sort of life is full circle here at this moment. But what was interesting is at that point, a bot had just passed the Turing test in the UK. Right now, fast forward to by the time I was finishing writing this book, here's what had already happened. An opposition candidate in Korea created AI Yoon, Y-O-O-N, you guys can Google that, and that was an avatar of this candidate running for himself. Then Prime Minister Narendra Modi created an avatar allowing him to campaign in all the different languages in India, and that people could access through WhatsApp. At the same time, you had several parliamentary candidates run. They were running, but they had avatars of them as well. And then in America, in Cheyenne, Wyoming, you had a person attempt to put Vic, a virtual integrated citizen, on the ballot as an AI. Didn't work because it says you have to have a physical candidate. But this just shows you the progression in 10 years. And so I do think that we're going to continue to see in the next phase, I think you're going to see a lot of politicians sort of digitally twin themselves and use those chatbots or whatever you want to call them, avatars, to basically converse with voters 24/7. There is a catch. And the catch is, if you Google Father Justin, you'll see what the problem is. So a Catholic group created Father Justin so that people could talk to a priest 24/7. It didn't work so well. Within a couple of days, the priest was giving them general absolution and had the backstory about how he was about where he went to divinity school and all this. I'm not Catholic, but it was like a hallucination. And so they had to basically shut down Father Justin pretty quickly before, I guess they defrocked Father Justin. But so the challenge would be, if you build one of these avatars to make sure it's not saying anything crazy that shows up in television. But I would say, just recently, and the last point is the fellow that won the Democratic mayoral primary in New York had an avatar that he used to answer questions. So I do think you could use this as a legitimate tool in a democracy to have more one-to-one participation, what we would call in America retail politics. So I think there are some positives here too, as well.
There's an example in the UK as well. So there's an MP called Mark Sewards, who's Labour West Yorkshire, and he has worked alongside an AI firm to create an avatar of himself, and that avatar answers questions.
Yes. And before him was AI Steve, who also was an MP, but he didn't win. Yeah.
Well, he already won, thankfully.
But you could theoretically have these that could be for the water system, for the trash collection, and people could talk to it, and it might be a more human way to give feedback to a government system.
And we accept chatbots in so many different things. You go online. Would you like to talk about this before you buy your new heating system or whatever it is? Talk through your options. So we already accept it as part of our lives, and it's root into our democracy. Well, it's already happened. It's just how far it goes. Right. I will now hand over to you. I'll take a couple of questions and we'll let the panel answer. Please do wait for the microphone to come to you as we are recording. I'll see you right there, person at the front and then right at the back.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. Considering you all know what AI can be and all the ways humanity can use it, I'm just wondering, it's a question for each one of the speakers. Knowing all that, what gives you hope?
Great question. Thanks. We'll take the question right at the back. And
Thanks. I think Oscar Wilde said that the problem with socialism is that it takes too many evenings. Let's just suggest that that's democracy in this case. And I do wonder, I work in consultation by day, and consultation is wide open to being spoofed by AI. And I mean, for the American on the panel, the worst thing you can do in the UK is to do something without asking somebody first. So consultation is really important to us. But it's very easy to do online using a bot that you can just set to make hundreds and hundreds of responses that can't be disambiguated from one another. And for me, the thing that I've been thinking about a lot here is that this is going to result in the return to in-person, face-to-face meetings, because that's the one thing that's very, very difficult to replicate with AI, and that if we are going to see lots of job destruction through AI, that's something that people end up doing much more of, is face-to-face decision-making about really important issues. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Great. Shall we take those two questions first? Hope, and then Ava, do you want to?
Hope. I like the idea there might be some. Yeah, so I think there are a few things that give me hope. I mean, I'm still in the camp that believes that, you know, we have some agency in deciding whether we engage with AI in our lives. It's embedded in lots of things we do. But, you know, we can still push towards the development of sovereign large language models that allow us to decide what data it's trained on. We can look at open source models so that they are inspectable and editable and other people can use them. Collaboratives where people share their data. There's a collaborative called Transcribus, which is a sort of it's a heritage sector thing where lots of people in the heritage sector came together, shared all their data and created something that could read languages, you know, ancient languages, and keep all of that stuff digitized. And that was a charity. I think they've just sort of finished their research funding and are looking for ongoing funding. So audits, governance, transparency, creating new and robust user consent models. Consent is an issue we've not touched on, but one that's ridden roughshod over by AI and the way that they're trained. I think hoping that when we inform everybody about how these kinds of models work, they can make better decisions about whether they use them or not and why, and it should really be down to the individual. And I think we are seeing governments doing things without consultation, one of which I think is the decisions by the UK and the US governments to develop relationships with OpenAI. I didn't see that being a consultation point. I would have liked to have had a say in that. So I think there's lots of stuff happening at the moment that is linked to fear of missing out. Like there's a FOMO in all governments at the moment as they panic because they're like, oh God, what if we don't get ahead of all of this? You know, we won't win the arms race. And that's being fueled by AI companies purely because they want to keep making money. So there's an element to bear in mind that this is not inevitable, that actually we do have choice moments, that there might be an AI bust where actually they fail to deliver on that next phase of AI, in which case we look to some other technology, nanotech or whatever, you know, it doesn't really matter. So my hope lies in that it might all just fall on its bum, that we have mechanisms in place where we can make better decisions and we can consult people more directly, and that, you know, we have the opportunity to opt out and maybe break some models sometimes through bad behavior.
So, Hope, I love your question. Okay, when I wrote the book, what I discovered was that this goes back to Mary Shelley. How many people here have read Frankenstein? Okay, so you know the story in Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley wrote it in 1818, and she wrote it after gathering with her friends around a lake in Italy and telling ghost stories. This gave her the idea. The underlying premise of Frankenstein is that humans create a thing, and then the thing turns on us and either kills us or we have to kill it, right? And so this is a wheel it's a story that we've told each other for a very long time. The Terminator movies, all that. All this goes back to Mary Shelley, or maybe arguably Goethe, who wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice as a poem a little bit before Mary Shelley did. Okay, so that's in the West. This is a problem because we say, okay, man creates a technology, the technology turns on us, and we have to kill it, right? And so in part, I wrote Lincoln 2.0 to point that out and to point out maybe this myth that we have, this Frankenstein mythos, is not helpful to us. Other cultures don't have this mythos. And so the thing is, we turn out to, we create a technology. The technology helps us. What if it saves us? And so one of my points in writing this novel was to realize that to help people realize we have a mental model in the West of creating a technology. The technology is a mirror to our own being, and we know we're not perfect, and then we're afraid of it, right? And it turns on us, right? And so anyway, the book was written in a hopeful sense. And so you see it in the novel, although it's a tragedy, the creation of Lincoln 2.0 is not a tragedy. It's the creation of a new thing, which turns out to help a lot of people, including the main character. But that's the idea. So we can all think about Mary Shelley tonight and Frankenstein.
Thanks, great question. What gives me hope is that, you know, I'm old enough to remember when the internet became a thing. I finished my high school exams in Italy, where I'm from, and on the day I finished my exams, I got my first internet connection. That's the kind of geek I was as a kid. You know, instead of going out and play or, you know, go with my girlfriend, I logged on with a modem and went on a news group. And for the first 20 years of the internet, we experienced this euphoria that you know, it was all good and it was not possible to regulate it. It had to be free. It was a liberation technology, period. And I think now we live in an era that is much more rational and realistic about digital technology. It is those things. It can be those things. It is also a lot of other things, partly because it's used by humans and structures and organizations and institutions that don't always have good intentions. They're not always authentic. They're not always there to help their neighbor. And so at least we are at a stage where, even though the technologies we're facing now are incredibly more powerful than that little modem that I got in my bedroom, we are facing them with a more clear-eyed vision of, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly that technology can do. And so we're probably better equipped to not be completely blindsided when something happens and, oh, all of a sudden we realize that it can be used for misinformation. Oh, well, we started with that question. We didn't start with that question when the internet came about, even though in principle it could be and was used for that as well. I'll say something to the second question, if that's okay. I think this is a great point, and you know, in a sense, I feel your pain. I think on one level, I see, you know, I participate in some of these exercises, and I can imagine it must be a very middle-class crowd and a very expert crowd that bothers to take part in a consultation where you need to produce, you know, coherent content that speaks to the issues, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I wonder, you know, to what extent does that underrepresent groups and people that don't feel they have that sense of efficacy, that knowledge, those skills, those civic skills in the first place, to be able to fill out that form or to participate in that exercise. So on one level, you know, these tools could help people that don't feel like they write very well, they struggle to make a coherent point, they feel they are inferior, they're not as well educated, they don't feel they have the capacity, but maybe they have a thought that can be very concisely expressed, and then, you know, AI can help them formulate that thought in a more compelling way, in a way that they feel comfortable with, and they will participate. So in a sense, it could help widen the pool of participants in a legitimate, authentic way. And that's the hopeful part. I can totally see how the other side of the coin can be very damaging for these exercises. To that end, I wonder though, you know, we do online banking, right? We sign a lot of contracts online. A lot of our lives, very meaningful transactions these days are completed online. There are safety systems that make those transactions possible, and that, broadly speaking, they protect them from, you know, malicious attacks and invasions. And I wonder, isn't it partly a matter of us finding technical systems that make sure that, you know, one citizen, one vote, one citizen, one account, one a token to participate in consultation, right? I think the idea of bots was partly became relevant because, you know, there were platforms that allowed people to create accounts with no verification, no authentication. I used bots to do surveys on Twitter 15 years ago, back in the day. So I know how to create a bot and I know how to automate that behavior, and it can be done much more easily with AI these days. But at the same time, it can be done easily if the platforms allow that to be done easily, right? And it goes back to the point, we can choose, especially when we set up public processes, which guardrails and safeguards to create so that one person, one vote, one person, one identity, one participation in a consultation, reducing the risk that you're referring to.
Bob, Eva, do you want to comment more on the consultation bit, or anything that Christian has said?
I suppose what I was thinking while Christian was speaking, I was like, but that does sound good, but what about privacy? My worry about this kind of those kinds of models is that nothing then is private. You know, we're moving so far away from the point at which deliberation occurred in spaces that were, even if they were public, there was an expectation of privacy in public, you know, that concept, right? So, and when everything is digitized, when everything is online, then aren't there just colossal privacy issues? I mean, there are colossal privacy issues that emerge. And I suppose the other thing that occurs to me is, I suppose we have to decide when depth is important, because I accept the fact that these technologies can be brilliant if you are dyslexic, or, you know, have students who are dyslexic who use it, or if you feel that you want to refine your writing style or whatever it is, or summarize quite quickly. But if you use the tool constantly and you fail to generate the depth of knowledge required for a particular subject, then isn't there something lost there? You know, because you're just top slicing, and and maybe that's fine, maybe that's what the future looks like, but those questions often emerge. I think quite regularly about, I did a piece of research with accounting companies, which sounds very tedious, but it's really interesting actually, and looking at and this was about 6 years ago, and they were looking at what AI might mean for them. And even at that point, they were saying, well, we don't need that. Because I originally trained to be an accountant many, many years ago, and you were given like a bag of receipts, and you went with your bag of receipts and you had to turn it into a series of books, and it was just tedious and time consuming, but you had to do that work in order to move up the scale, and that knowledge was something that allowed you to become a good accountant. When I was interviewing these people, they said, oh, we don't really, you know, we're not going to need that anymore, because what we need is data analysts. We don't need all of that because that's automated, we scan stuff. So the problem they had was they then had all these people hired at middle management that didn't have that foundational knowledge to allow them to do all the other things required of accounting, and they were trying to solve that problem. I don't know whether it's been solved since, but I can see this happening across professions. What happens to depth?
Bob, do you have anything? No. I mean, it's interesting, because I think there's that challenge, isn't there? We have, whether it's AI or the internet, digital experiences, digital information on one hand versus in-person experiences. There's that tension in democracy too then, because there's the ability to be able, using the avatars, using the bots, whatever you know, however they're constructed, to reach more people, which you might think actually that could be good, that could be very, very engaging for people. It reaches people where they are. It means that if you're working, you know, long shifts and you can never get to the political meetings in person, you can still engage later on. But does it do something to our understanding of, and I suppose it's another way of asking that question, Eva, that you've just asked about depth. There's a superficiality, or there must be a superficiality to those engagements with that political bot.
So I do have a theory that basically a counter-reaction, there's always a reaction, a counter-reaction. There's always what becomes widespread and what becomes scarce. So I do think in politics you're going to get shorter speeches that are handwritten or that are clearly designed by the speaker, by the politician. I do think you're also going to get very long rallies, kind of like what you see in America with like the Trump rallies, where the speaker is completely contemporaneous. He's just off the cuff, right? I think you could see that. And I also think you're going to see politicians become a little bit more idiosyncratic in their communication as a way to guard against people just thinking that they're synthetic and just writing their speeches on ChatGPT, right? So what's the reaction against that? Shorter speeches that are handwritten, that is obviously in that person's hand, in that person's voice. Longer sort of rallies where you're talking in depth about how you feel about something. Love them or hate them, Trump does quite a bit of that. And then more idiosyncratic politicians, that people would know them by all these like tics that are not something that you would just use a generic chatbot to do.
And that almost flies in the face of how we've seen politics develop over the last 20, 30 years, where you conform, this is how you speak, this is how you behave, this is how... So I'll keep my idiosyncrasies then, thanks. More questions. We've got a couple of question there.
Me?
No, sorry, the person behind you first, and a microphone will come to you.
Yeah, I'm probably one of the people that the gentleman was speaking about there that doesn't know much about this, but I mean, the example of the internet terrifies a lot of people because the regulation doesn't seem to work. I mean, only this morning in the papers, there was quite a bit of stuff about children as young as 6 accessing pornography. And I just wondered what the panel would suggest in the regulationary framework to stop groupthink, where the experts are discussing with the tech bros how to regulate the sector. Surely we need somebody in there that will get down and dirty and say, look, how much of a fine will they respond to? I mean, stuff like that. I mean, there seems a danger of groupthink in setting up the regulatory framework is what I'm saying. Yeah.
Thanks for that. A couple of questions towards the front. I'll take that one and then we'll come to this person.
So, Bob, you said when you started off speaking that one day we'll be voting for AI candidates. Mm-hmm. What AI candidate would you give your vote for to?
Hi there. I think since we're in Scotland, I'd like to quote a little bit of Macbeth. The instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to lead us to our doom. That for me is the chatbot in a nutshell. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have, I know you're all here representing the positive side, but do you lie in bed at night and think, shit, one rogue bot could destroy the planet? Because I do.
Great question. Thank you. Who wants to attempt any others? Eva?
I'll have a stab at the rogue bot thing. I mean, I'm not going to answer that question sort of directly, but slightly to the side, in that I think I worry more about that kind of, have you heard that term shitification? Cory Doctorow is not my term, I'm not swearing out of hand, wrote a book, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's brilliant, but you know, the idea that everything is just becoming a bit more shit. And I think AI bots are just, for me, the classic example of that, because whoever got a satisfying answer from an AI bot? I mean, really, yes, it might allow you to get information faster in some very sort of narrow cases, like if you go, it will give you like a faster answer than a Q&A list maybe, but you ask something more complex and you find yourself in a loop of horror trying to get through to ringing and speaking to a human being. And so I just don't, and I think there's something about the economic model that enables that. You know, the technology in any other context we can't speak about because we don't know, but in the current sort of economic neoliberal model within which we operate, I can't see any real super benefits to it. And whether there'll be a rogue bot, I would hope at the moment it's just not smart enough for anything bad to happen. In none of the sort of the high risk domains at this moment do I know of this kind of technology being used where it could sort of destroy the world, because there's still the belief that a human in the loop is important in sensitive domains, and the AI, the sort of the EU AI Act does expressly talk about that. And actually, European Union gives me a little bit of hope as well, responding to that hope question, because they are much more protection-oriented than, for example, the States or other countries.
So I'll answer your question and your questions. So I do think we already have examples of, let me just say, computational models almost breaking the bank. So like, you're familiar that in the States we've had a couple stock market mini crashes that were basically driven by computational purchasing models of stock, and then we had to hit the breaker switch basically. The SEC had to hit the switch and stop the market from trading. And so, you know, there are things like that. If the more you do programmatic trading on a thing like Wall Street, the more you could have sort of a crazy thing like that. There's also a theory that you would use AI for cyber defense and cyber offense, in which case you could have it just, you know, things could get out of control. So I think there's legitimate things there. So who would I want to run? Obviously Abraham Lincoln. But one of the fun things that I discovered about this is I first started thinking, okay, how would you build it? People wouldn't vote for superintelligence. They would vote for something that they knew. And I'm an American. In American context, Abraham Lincoln's one of the most popular presidents in our history, known as the Great Emancipator. That's a plus. And we have the most biographies of him. And we have all of his papers and his telegraphs to his generals. And so we have a lot of information that we could use to train. And in the book, there's also a fun chapter where the main character convenes all these Lincoln historians to be expert trainers as well, and they all get drunk drinking beer, talking about how they're going to do it. And so, yes, so my answer would be Lincoln. But what's interesting is you could, in a future scenario, you could take other famous politicians who have a very long career, a lot of written material and decisions. So in the American context, FDR would be a great example because he served many terms and he was the Secretary of the Navy going back to World War I. And so I think other cultures may be able to try something like this. And I do have a theory, which I've been trying to get to in speaking with some of the presidential libraries, that they need to be the first ones to build these AIs, but for the president of their library. That way the public would be in control of that thing. And then in a future, I could imagine a basically cabinet where a president has a cabinet of former presidents who are all AI versions giving advice and thoughts. And so you could be a future decision-making president and you could go talk to, say, FDR or Truman, and they would say, well, when I was getting through this, this is what I decided and how I made my decision. And it would reference the presidential library of that, person. So I do think that could end up being a really cool decision-making tool, which could be mimicked in other cultures and other societies. So.
Before I hand over to Christian, I'm interested that would you change anything in any of those presidents? Because so I suppose what would your ideal AI politician be? Would it be somebody who's existed? Because I'm not sure that I would feel comfortable having somebody seeking advice from people who were alive 100, 200 years ago. Because what do they know about today's context? Nothing. And do they bring with them the racism, all of the biases that were prevalent, arguably still are prevalent today?
Well, what's fun is, so the book actually explores this. So if you bring back, if you revivify a 19th century man, you might bring back some of their 19th century values, right? In this case, Abraham Lincoln was a very odd politician for his time. He was actually believed in equality, right? And so that makes him odd. He was also not apparently religious until the war, and the war made him more religious, but he was actually being criticized as a scoffer. He was much more like some of our founding fathers. He was not, he was a deist, but he was not personally much of a Christian. But I explore this in the book because, for example, people have gauzy views of Abraham Lincoln, but in 21st century view, he would be what we would call a billboard lawyer, like a very famous, because that's what he was. He was one of America's top courtroom litigators, and he was a very good lawyer, famous for getting criminals off, out of jail, and for many other things. And so you're right. We had in the book, I point out that it's really hard. It was really hard for these historians to say, okay, this is a person that lived before the suffrage movement, that lived before the labor movement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What would they think? And then they come up with sort of how he would think about them, but with the primary purpose of conserving the Union, which was his main goal, which I write about in terms of the polarization of our society. But it is, my theory is that humans wouldn't naturally want to vote for a superintelligence. They would want to vote for something, the defect is a positive. You at least know the person's character and what they were historically, even if they had some blind spots or some problems, and that at least tells you where their go and no-go zones are. That's my theory anyway.
Can you just wait for the microphone?
Just as an aside on Lincoln, you will know that women all over the world wrote to Mary Lincoln to try and persuade Lincoln to move from the Civil War being about economics to about anti-slavery. So flipping that made Lincoln great. So going back to your point in time, Lincoln at 1840, very different from Lincoln later on. So which Lincoln do we want?
And in fact, there's a chapter of the book where they actually debate this. Do we want they call it the pan Lincoln, or do we have or are we trying to recreate Lincoln right before his assassination? And the decision is to be Lincoln right before his assassination. And what you're referencing for the audience is what happened was the women's suffrage movement grafted onto the racial equality movement. And unfortunately, once you had the end of slavery, though, some of the famous abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, didn't really go through and support the women's suffrage movement, and it petered out in the post-war years. It's a fascinating historical aside.
Thanks, Bob. Christian, back to the questions about regulating groupthink, shootification. Which of those do you want to pick up?
I will briefly address the point about regulation. It's a great question. I would say, as a minimum, we should think about human rights as a standard. What do we want to achieve? We want to achieve, we want to facilitate the promotion of basic human rights. But I'll say something about that goes even before that, and that's the first thing I could do if I had, a magic wand is I would increase protection against concentration and monopolies. We are dealing with an extremely concentrated marketplace where a very limited number of companies directly owned or funded by tech giants are building the foundational models that are going to then result in the tools we are using directly or indirectly through other companies. And I think the last 30 years I've seen a retrenchment in how states break up monopolies and punish practices that reduce competition. And the result has been the concentration of power that you were referring to as groupthink. There is too few of those people that are in charge of too big of a slice of the pie. They have too much power vis-a-vis regulators, but they also have too much power vis-a-vis us, the consumers. And I think that would be the first thing I would do if I could change the approach to regulation of these issues, even before we look at processes, content, technology, and so forth.
Ava, did you want to come back?
I was just going to mention a really good book related to that called Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis. Brilliant. It sort of summarises that and just sort of says that we've recreated a feudal system within which our tech overlords basically own us in entirety, really, and including our behaviours and influence our practice. And I think we are seeing a lot of that, and AI is just the latest instrument in that.
And that has profound consequences for our democracy as well, doesn't it? Sorry, Bob, you were going to...
For the audience, I think you're referring to what they call feudalism 2.0 and the idea that if you live below the tech layer, you're a serf, but if you want to live above it, basically, isn't that?
Well,
is that kind
the idea that anybody who isn't an owner of a big tech company is part of the feudal system and not the good side.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting because a potentially countermeasure, something that could be that would be more emancipatory, could be. There's a very famous book called The Diamond Age, or A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer. Fantastic science fiction novel, highly recommend, by Neil Stephenson. And in the story, a father wants to create this special book for his daughter, A Young Lady's Illustrated Primer. This is in a far future. And it will use technology to help educate her to be the perfect woman, the perfect lady, and also outcompete all the other people. And so he does this out of love, building this for his daughter. But he ends up losing the book. And the book falls into the hands, and there's a lot of Victorian themes in this book, into the hands of a young street urchin girl who has, her parents are not around or anything. And so she gets this book, and it turns her into this really, really smart young girl. And so, but the idea of the book, what Neil Stephenson imagined this way before we had this, but you could literally do this with AI now and with LLMs now, where you could basically use something like this to teach a child and basically automate that process. And in the science fiction novel, the book speaks to the girl and it teaches her lessons, but it teaches it through fairy tales and everything else. And the girl, because her parents just aren't around, the book becomes basically her parents, and it works out well for her, but it leads to the rest of the plot dynamics of the story. So there's a possibility that that's something we could use the technology for in a good way.
think we've got time for maybe one last question. I saw a hand at the front here. Person in the striped shirt.
Thanks. You may have covered part of this question in your answers, but I was thinking that before AI, if someone published an academic paper, you have to show your sources, checkable references. Nowadays, an AI answer just gives you the answer, no workings. It must be easy for the machine to say how it got there, I assume. Should this not be compulsory?
You can get models to show you sources, but the issue is that they're often wrong. So quite often, because I see it when people apply to me to do a PhD under my supervision, as particularly international students, I'll often get check the sources to see whether it was AI generated, because they don't check. But also, increasingly, you're seeing sort of sources, particularly within AI summaries on search interfaces, where it'll sort of have like, you know, a couple of icons showing where it came from, but not exactly which bit of information. So I mean, companies are starting to respond to it. But the issue is that the content isn't often right. The sources aren't always correct. And so it's not, you know, it's not perfect. But that transparency is one of the core issues you quite rightly identified that underpin sort of responsible use of AI. Like where does the data come from? Where does the information that you're being fed come from? How do we know if it's truthful? All of that underpins all of the kinds of stuff that we've been talking about. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that, because I think we didn't touch on it.
The interesting thing is, so what you're describing right now in some of the summaries, they'll have the links. They may or may not be exactly right. But we could create a culture in which it's just expected that those links would be provided. And then the question would be, would those data sources be really considered high quality? Would it be like from the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Library of Congress? Like I'm thinking about things that we all agree are like good sources. Webster's Dictionary, right? Things that were like, we know are good sources, right? And so that's an interesting question.
It's true, and I've just reminded me of another point as you were speaking, which is, but then how do those organisations, those sources, sustain themselves? If everything is mediated through AI, then how do those organisations that previously made their money through the monetisation model of the internet, how do they make their money? They don't. They have to find other models of finance, so they'll just all disappear.
And also, it reinforces the idea that these sources, which we take as authoritative, but they're authoritative in a very particular culture. They're authoritative in a very particular language. They replicate a lot of the structural inequalities, quite frankly, that that we might actually be trying, particularly if we're thinking about democracy and politics, we might be trying to overturn. So how do we regulate in such a way that shows the working, but doesn't rely on an ever-reducing set or that constant reduction of it comes back to your superficiality point again, the depth of analysis, but also the depth of possibility.
I was going to say, actually, there's an artist exhibition, which is free, at the university in the bit called In Space, which is near the Informatics Forum, where artists have explored some of these issues. And the artist I'm thinking of was Wesley Goatley, and he's got three little sort of demonstrations of different views. One, I think, is a harbinger, a hope, and a horizon, or something like that. But one of them, where he imagines a future within which communities develop LLMs, where actually all of the information in there is specific to community languages, specific to things that go on in their environment, and they're able to actually underpin and support a democratic system. So it's quite a nice little thing. You can interact with it and just see how that might work. It's worth going along. It's open for another couple of days. It's actually the programme that I direct funded it, but there's a series of different artist interventions, and they're all kind of wonderful.
I mean, Christian.
This is great because we're connecting what you're talking about with the economics of it, and this is a challenge. So I think it's fun that you mentioned art. One of the AI has created a number of problems for artists right now, especially authors, because like some of these could be pulling their works and they're not getting paid the royalties. So in the United States, there's all these lawsuits from authors saying, "Hey, you took my work, but I'm not getting my royalties." And now it's in the model. So what do I do? And it's crazy. Two related stories to this is one, when you publish nowadays, you get Amazon or other people, they will ping you back and say, guarantee that this is not written by like AI. That's interesting, bit one. But the second bit is, if you ask it to summarize basic novels that are already out there, it will, which kind of defeats the purpose of buying the thing. And I was surprised that my novel was summarized to an extent that it was kind of like killing the surprise endings and everything else in it. And so there is a question about how we build economic models that make sure that this works and doesn't hurt artists. And we're, of course, here at the festival.
And actually, there was recently a government consultation about copyright that, but they gave a really short timescale to respond. It was something like 6 weeks, and it was close to Christmas. So actually, convening people was almost impossible. But they got the largest response they had done for any consultation within several years, because artists are terrified of their incomes being undermined by this, and there are no rules around it. And there's something about what somebody described to me the other day as the gentleman's agreement of how we share and use data on the internet. It's been completely sort of ridden roughshod over by AI. So sometimes it might be illegal. Sometimes AI systems do things that you could sort of identify as an illegality. For the most part, they don't. But what they do is they undermine our sort of norms and agreements of internet and appropriate behaviour. And artists will often put their stuff online. But I mean, there are some people developing models now that are intended to do things like watermarking content so that you can't scrape it, but then that can affect the aesthetics of a thing. So if it's an image, then artists perhaps don't like that because it has to be machine readable, right? So it's often visible to the human eye. So there are some responses to it, but the nature of computer science, and I think that kind of hacking culture that underpins pretty much most computer science sort of ethos, means that somebody creates a solution and somebody wants to break it. Somebody creates a model, somebody wants to break it. So it's this endless whack-a-mole of, thing that's bad, somebody breaking it, somebody else coming along doing another bad thing. It's constant.
Christian.
I just wanted to say that I agree that we can get to a point where models provide sources and sources are, less likely to be hallucinations. I think we need to ask ourselves, however, what is the status, what are the prospects today for having a healthy system of authoritative, good quality sources, whichever way we define them. I was involved in a lot of initiatives to combat the spread of misinformation through policies, through research. And one of the things that always comes up is, yes, but the first thing to reduce the threat of misinformation is to have a system of good quality information that people trust. And that is very difficult when the political economy of news production is being completely destroyed, not by AI, but by 20 years of digital revolution where, for some reason, we've just got used to the idea that everything has to be free and that we don't want to pay for our paper, for our magazine anymore. There is a return to subscriptions, to membership models. It's a very big topic, but the problem is most news organizations these days are struggling for money and they can't fund the kind of journalism that we need, especially at the local level, which is where it can probably make the biggest difference, because there will always be some national media in a rich enough society. But at a local level, you have what in the US they call news deserts, where there is no local news outlet that covers in big cities, like cities that would be, the third biggest city in the UK. And so and AI makes it worse to the extent that it doesn't direct enough traffic to these publishers. So if some of the money they hope to make is through advertisements or through conversion by selling a subscription to somebody who goes on their website because they clicked on a Google link, well, now they're less likely to click. They're going to be shown fewer links by chatbots, and they're less likely to click on them. There's research that shows that already. And so news organizations are seeing traffic decline, which is why, partly why the New York Times is suing OpenAI for copyright infringement, right? So they are trying to fight back, but they are, surfing against the tide because of 20 years of drastic changes to their revenue streams, which in most cases has meant reductions. So as a society, I think we also need to think about, while we regulate technology and try to think about how to regulate AI and technology, how do we enhance the likelihood that we have healthy news, a healthy news ecosystem that can produce good quality journalism, whichever way we define it.
Let me ask you this. I mean, okay, so if we all, as all the people here believe in democracy, so we have to have a really strong media. We have to have a lot of journalists doing firsthand reporting, right? And we want a creative class. Does that mean that we might go back to physical media like magazines or newspapers? Would we go back? I mean, one of my theory is we might go back to magazines, to really high-end magazines that people would want to read. But might we go back to physical media? What do you think?
In the same way as replicating the in-person experience, because that's authentic. Right. Yeah.
I mean, as a good old European progressive, I think public service media is a decent solution to that problem. Independent, well-funded, and well-run public service media. You know, the BBC in this country still does, a decent job, better than most, but it's not enough. I think it's intriguing to think about the physical, kind of like the question about physical consultations. Physical media is an intriguing idea. My parents used to have a newspaper shop, and so I'm intrinsically attracted to that. I'm not sure that's going to work for 18-year-olds, though.
I mean, it's interesting. We've come, Eva, you used the phrase earlier in answer to another question that it's the economic neoliberal model that's the problem, and that's underpinned so many of what we said. If only democracy could fix that. But maybe that's for another time. Folks, we have come to the end of our session this evening. I just want to give the panellists 10 seconds. Is there any last burning point that you want to leave us with before we leave this evening? Eva.
Oh my God, I wasn't expecting that, but come to me last.
Okay. You don't have to, but Christian, anything about AI, democracy, what do we all need to be thinking about?
I think we need to be thinking about equality and the prospects for increasing equality at a time where inequalities of all kinds are increasing.
I think we need to be thinking about how to make the economic model support the values that we have. And I think we need to think about how to make the technology serve us the way we want it to serve us. I think those would be the two things.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, I think we need to be thinking about understanding the technology better, and through that understanding, learning how to tweak it and break it a little bit so it meets our needs.
Great. Great way to finish our conversation. Please join me in thanking very much Christian, Bob, and Eva. Folks, Festival of Politics carries on for another 2 days. There are lots of other events taking place, including Professor Danny Dorling talking about inequality tomorrow. And on Friday, there is another session on AI and disinformation. So slightly different focus, but also the threats, perhaps, that AI brings to us. But thank you again for coming along this evening. Please, if you can, use the QR code or the paper surveys that are around the place to tell us how we can make these kinds of events better in future. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you.